Inflation didn't scare policymakers in the 1970s, not at first. They believed it was temporary, cyclical, manageable, a side effect of growth, until 1979. That year, a revolution in Iran triggered an oil shock that didn't just raise prices. It exposed a deeper fracture in the global financial system. It shattered the illusion that inflation could be nudged lower with polite adjustments. It forced central banks to choose between political comfort and economic credibility. And in doing so, it marked a structural break in the modern global economy. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. This is the story of the 1979 oil shock, not just as a spike in energy prices, but as the moment the modern financial system was forced to confront its own fragility. Because 1979 wasn't about oil alone, it was about expectations, credibility, and the cost of restoring trust once it begins to slip. To understand 1979, we need to go back a few years. In 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold, effectively dismantling the post-war monetary framework known as the Bretton Woods system. For decades, global currencies had been tied to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was linked to gold. But rising deficits and global demand for dollars put pressure on that system. When Nixon closed the gold window, the world entered a new monetary era where currencies floated freely, and stability depended on policy credibility. Then came the first oil shock. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, oil-exporting nations imposed an embargo on Western countries. Oil prices surged, and inflation accelerated across advanced economies. But the embargo didn't create inflation, it exposed it. By the mid-1970s, the United States faced stagflation. High inflation combined with rising unemployment. Policymakers believed they could gradually manage the problem. They underestimated psychology. Inflation isn't just a number. It's a pattern of expectations. When workers expect higher prices, they demand higher wages. Businesses anticipating those wages raise prices further. The cycle reinforces itself. By the late 1970s, that cycle was deeply embedded. Then the second shock arrived. In early 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew Iran's government and brought new leadership under Ruhollah Khomeini. Iran was one of the world's largest oil producers, and the disruption cut global supply. Oil prices surged from about $15 per barrel in 1978 to nearly $40 by 1980. Inflation spiked again across the global economy. By 1979, the credibility of the Federal Reserve was under pressure. Then a new chairman arrived, Paul Volcker. Volcker believed inflation had become structural. In October 1979, the Federal Reserve allowed interest rates to rise dramatically to restrict money growth. Rates eventually climbed above 19%. This was economic shock therapy. The consequences were painful. Unemployment surged, housing markets froze, and businesses struggled under extremely high borrowing costs. The shock spread internationally as many developing countries that had borrowed heavily in dollars suddenly faced soaring debt payments. Yet the strategy worked. By the early 1980s, inflation had collapsed, and central banks around the world adopted a new doctrine. Credibility must come first. History doesn't repeat line for line, but the structural pressures remain. Energy remains geopolitical. Debt remains high. Inflation remains psychological. Central banks remain the last line of defense. If you want to understand how money and power operate, not in theory, but in practice, study 1979. Study the moment policymakers realized that credibility, once lost, demands sacrifice to restore. And remember this, the modern global economy was not shaped by smooth evolution. It was forged in moments of crisis, when leaders were forced to choose between comfort and stability. In 1979, they chose stability. The cost was recession. The reward was restored trust. Every financial system eventually faces its test. The oil shock of 1979 was one of those tests, and it rewrote the rules. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.